there are several elements common to the mystical paths of the major world religions. Among the elements I will be discussing today are: 1, the mystics' pursuit of the indwelling presence of God; 2, their pursuit of direct intercourse with God through prayer and contemplation; and 3, their pursuit of a threefold path of ascent to God. What did the mystics mean when they talked about the indwelling presence of God? What does Saint Germain mean when he talks about that presence? Well, the mystics believe that the soul is meant to be the dwelling place of God and a partaker of the divine nature. In Christian mysticism, this teaching goes back to the words of Jesus and the apostles. At the Last Supper, Jesus promised his disciples, "If a man love me, he will keep my words, and my Father will love him, and we will come unto him and make our abode with him." Keeping the words of Jesus in our heart, and ultimately the word that he was, the I am that I am, makes us one with him. This is Jesus' promise that the Father, the mighty I am presence, and the individual Holy Christ self will descend and take up their abode in our temple here and now while we are in embodiment, if we keep Jesus' words, if we maintain that spirit of the living flame of love burning in our hearts, if we express the compassion of Christ to all. This can happen to you more quickly than you realize when you determine no more to behave after the carnal mind, but after the Christ. The mystics spoke of the indwelling presence of God in 2 senses. First, they believe that all men are by nature like God, and that within every soul there is a spark of the divine. The 14th century theologian and mystic Meister Eckhart taught, "There is something in the soul that is so akin to God that it is one with him. God's seed is within us. There is a part of the soul," said Eckhart, "that is untouched by time or mortality. It proceeds out of the Spirit and remains eternally in the Spirit and is divine. Here God glows and flames without ceasing in all his abundance and sweetness and rapture." Meister Eckhart could not have so written had he not so experienced. What he was describing is the divine spark, which is technically, as you know, not a part of the soul. Sometimes the early Christian mystics did not distinguish between the soul and the divine spark. The threefold flame or divine spark is the seed of the divine within us. It is the seed of the inner Christ and the inner Buddha. I have discussed the divine spark as the first way the mystics conceived of the indwelling presence of God. I will now discuss the indwelling Christ as the second way they conceived of this indwelling presence of God. The Apostle Paul was the first mystic who recorded the concept of the indwelling Christ being formed in us. He wrote to the Galatians, "I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you. I live," he said, "yet not I, but Christ liveth in me." Paul proclaimed the Christ within as the inheritance of all Christians. He told the Colossians that God would make known to his saints how great are the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. The concept of the forming of Christ in you. If you have a holy Christ self, then why does Christ need to be formed in you? The holy Christ self is above you in higher planes. the forming of Christ in you, you can visualize as points of light coming together in concentration, originally dispersed and vapory with no form or shape. As you begin to know who is Christ and what is Christ, his attributes, his works, his words, as he lives daily, there is forming in you your concept of Christ, your image of Christ, the Christ whom you adore and whom you worship, the Christ who is your brother and teacher and friend. And so each day that Christ is being formed in you, becoming more concentrated as light, until the very presence and outline and truly the form of your holy Christ self is duplicated here below. So Paul was saying that Christ lived in him. And he discovered that when Christ lived in him, he no longer lived in himself. He said, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And so he was no longer I, Paul. He was I, Paul, one with the Christ, the fusion, the bonding. So let Christ be formed in you, and Christ will not be formed in you if you do not give attention to Jesus Christ, your holy Christ self, and your holy Christ flame daily. A second premise of the mystics was that the soul can have direct intercourse with God through mystical contemplation and prayer. I would call this meditation and devotional and invocative prayer. Devotion is where you give your whole heart and soul and love and mind to God. Invocative prayer is when you invoke the whole heart and soul of mind and mind of God to enter your being. To the mystics, prayer is not just a prescribed set of devotions and petitions to God. It is an interior prayer wherein we speak with God from the very depths of our soul. It is concentration upon God. It is a profound communion, free from distractions within and distractions without. John Climacus, a 7th century abbot of a monastery on Mount Sinai, said, "Prayer is by nature a dialogue and a union of man with God. Its effect is to hold the world together." Francisco de Osuna explained that those who wish to undertake any spiritual exercise must first understand that friendship and communion with God are possible in this life of exile. Teresa of Avila, who used Osuna's book, The Third Spiritual Alphabet, as a guide to contemplation, developed the theme of friendship with God through prayer. She wrote, "Mental prayer is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with Him, who we know loves us. Just as family ties and friendship are lost through a lack of communication," she said, "so is our relationship with God lost if we don't pray." The mystics spoke of prayer as a profound experience. A 14th century mystic, Walter Hilton, advised, "You should always seek with great diligence to come to the spiritual experience of God in prayer. Pray until you have that experience." Think of how much time we spend doing so many things that really don't count. How many hours people can spend shopping, for instance, or going to things of entertainment. Hours and hours go by, we think nothing of it. Isn't that true? We can celebrate and we can have feasts and we can have parties and we can do this and we can do that. When it comes to kneeling in prayer, how long are we good for? How long do we have the patience for? And yet, that experience is what is going to determine where your soul goes when this body is no longer capable of housing it. And that's something we always have to think about. I have reviewed the first element common to the mystical path, the pursuit of the indwelling presence of God, and the second, the pursuit of direct intercourse with God through contemplation and prayer. Now I shall take up the third. The pursuit of the threefold path of purgation, illumination, and union. This is a threefold path: purgation, illumination, and union. Some writers consider these stages a step-by-step path, one stage leading to the other. Others believe the stages can take place simultaneously, and that not every mystic experiences every stage. Saint Bonaventure, the 13th century theologian and disciple of Saint Francis, explains, "In the purgative stage, sin is expelled. In the illuminative stage, the soul learns the imitation of Christ, and in the unitive stage, the soul is day by day being united with God." He said that in the purgative stage, man comes to understand himself. In the illuminative stage, he comes to understand God. In the unitive, he strives to be united with God. Father John Arintero, a Catholic author on mysticism, said that for Bonaventure, all these exercises are reduced to 3 points. Who is God? Who am I? How can we become united through love? As you know, the word purgation comes from the verb to purge, to purge. Purgation comes to the soul only after she has experienced her awakening in God. This awakening brings joy to the soul. But when God's light suddenly enters the world of the mystic, he becomes acutely aware of his faults and weaknesses. This was the experience of the psalmist, whose psalm I read. He sees his imperfections against the backdrop of God's perfection. More importantly, he sees that his imperfections or sins are what separate him from God, and he can no longer tolerate the gulf. Take the 15th century Saint Catherine of Genoa. Her awakening came after years of loneliness and depression in an unhappy marriage. Her biographer recounts that she had reluctantly gone to make her confession at the urging of her sister. Suddenly, as she knelt before the priest, she received in her heart the wound of the unmeasured love of God. The wound. This transfer of love was of such high vibration, such an intensity, that it felt like a piercing. It felt almost as though she had been wounded. She had so clear a vision of her own misery and her faults and of the goodness of God that she almost fell upon the ground. And by these sensations of infinite love and of the offenses that had been done against this most sweet God, she was, by purifying affection, so greatly drawn away from the poor things of this world that she was almost beside herself, and for this she cried inwardly with ardent love, "No more world, no more sin." She returned home, kindled and deeply wounded with so great a love of God. She seemed beside herself. Her hatred of herself was more than she could endure. From this point on, Catherine walked the road of purgation. Catherine and other mystics describe the process by which the soul overcomes her impediments and reunites with God as a kind of purgatory, a kind of having to stay at a certain level of the astral plane in order to be purged of that very substance of the astral plane. As the soul makes her way to her first state, the pristine state of her creation, she said, her ardor in transforming herself into God is her purgatory. These words are not an exaggeration. To truly face and conquer the lesser self is arduous. We should not underestimate the challenge. We should know what we are getting into when we want to go all the way back to God in this life. This is what Paul meant when he said, I die daily. Paul saw a part of himself dying daily, and some of those parts he was attached to. Some of those parts he didn't necessarily want to see die. But by having Christ be formed in him, something else that was not the Christ had to die. Catherine of Genoa explained that what dies daily is not the soul, but portions of the lesser self. She wrote, I see rays of lightning darting from that divine love to the creature, so intense and fiery as to annihilate not the body alone, but were it possible, the soul. So she saw the darts of love descending from her mighty iron presence. She saw them penetrating and entering and purging. All this she experienced. She said these rays purify and then annihilate that which was impure. The soul becomes like gold that becomes purer as she is fired, all dross being cast out. What is obliterated and cast out is not the soul one with God, but the lesser self. Imagine she called that part of the self, the lesser self, the exact term that we use. Once stripped of all her imperfections, the soul rests in God. It's like the 7 days of creation, resting the seventh day. Author Serge Hughes says, Catherine of Genoa unquestionably belongs to the great and almost universal tradition of spiritual writers who see the spiritual life as a way or a process. Catherine is engaged in a journey, a continued struggle for perfection, or to use her favorite analogy, an endless battle between the false self and the true self. Every day, said Catherine, I feel that motes are being removed, which this pure love casts out. All the time, God does not cease to remove them. When we surrender to God and give ourselves to Him for this process, His position is, get it over with as quickly as possible. I want you home to my heart. I want to give you all of myself. I am your divine lover. I am your husband, your bridegroom. Come home to me. God knows that we suffer in the process, so if we give all of ourselves to Him, He steps up the process so that we can get through the pain to the bliss. During the process of purgation, the soul faces testings, trials, and temptations that come in many guises. It is in the crucible of testing that the virtues of Christhood are forged. There is no other way to forge your Christhood than in the crucible of testing. Some mystics experience the fires of purgation through the censure of their religious superiors. Meister Eckhart, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Jacob Berme, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and Simeon, the new theologian, were all at some time in their life suspected of questionable beliefs or called on the carpet for their teachings. Some were persecuted and imprisoned. When they were persecuted and imprisoned, it is because they were so close to God that they were becoming one with God, and they dared to affirm that. So it has ever been that the hierarchy of organized religion does not want the individual to get too close to God and therefore have no longer need of that hierarchy to come between. Saint Germain pioneered the path of Christian mysticism on the seventh ray, lifetime after lifetime, and he paid the price. He paid it for himself, and he paid it for all of us. He was the prophet Samuel. He was Saint Joseph, Saint Alban, the first British martyr. He was Roger Bacon, Christopher Columbus, Francis Bacon. And as he was in these embodiments, he labored long to liberate the souls of all people from the shackles of ignorance and superstition. Some mystics have described a certain element of the purgative process as a dark night. The 16th century mystic St. John of the Cross said there are two dark nights, the dark night of the senses and the dark night of the spirit. The dark night of the senses takes place during the purgative stage as a transition to the illuminative stage. The dark night of the spirit takes place before the ultimate union of the soul in Christ in the spiritual marriage. Author E.W. Dickens says, "Night is simply John's term for privation of desires, the self-privation, and eradication of attachment to all that is not God." How can you tell what is an inordinate desire? It is a desire that enslaves you, that you return to, that you cannot be free of, a desire in which you are not the master of both yourself and the desire. And it is by this progressively more complete privation that the soul is finally emptied of all that can fill her except God. Most people do not know the experience of being totally filled with God, and therefore to give up the known for the unknown is not easy. To be totally filled with God does not mean that you need to be a nun or a priest, or in a convent or in a cloister. It is far greater the challenge to be in the world, yet not of it, to be filled with God and to become one of those radiating points of light, like runners extending from the heart of Krishna or Maurya or Buddha. So I urge you to consider that your life will be far greater in joy when there is no room in you for anything but God. Because God is everything. God is everything that is real. Everything you could ever want, He will bring to you. Mary Baker Eddy said, "Divine love always has met and always will meet every human need." Every human need. That means when you are filled with God as divine love, God will give you everything that you lawfully need and that you lawfully want. I'm going to take up the dark night of the spirit when I discuss the spiritual marriage. So during the dark night of the senses, the mystic disciplines himself to overcome inordinate desires, desires that do not lead to his union with God. As St. John advised, to come to possess all, that is, all of God. If you really want that, desire the possession of nothing, and God will give you his all. The mystics recognize that one of the primary laws of spiritual progress is, as the soul becomes increasingly detached from the things of this world, she becomes increasingly attached to God. I have found in my experience that God uses a very interesting way in which to wean us from this world. He lets persecutions come upon us abundantly. And when we see the persecutions and we see what the world is capable of, somehow we lose a certain zest for that world. And we desire the most profound oneness with God. So I think God gives us a little bit of his spur and gives us some good kicks here and there, and lets our persecutions also be the means of bearing and balancing world karma. In the midst of adversity, you get a tremendous sense of co-measurement between the self that is God here and the self that is infinite and beyond all the pettiness of the planet. John outlined a two-step program to help the disciple get through the dark night of the senses. He said that by these two steps alone, the soul could conquer all inordinate desires that separate her from God. First, the mystic should have a habitual desire to imitate Christ in everything that he does. What would Jesus do? If you want to know what Jesus would do, you better read the Gospels over and over again, because you will find that he had a different response for different types of people. You also need to read the Gnostic Gospels, and if you want to, get my audio or videotapes of all the lectures I've given on Gnosticism, because there you see a different face of Jesus than you see in the four Gospels. So don't think that you automatically know what Jesus would do. Learn everything that he did in his life, contemplate how and why he did it, and then make your decision on what to do in that situation. He should meditate on Christ's life so that he may know how to behave in all things as Christ would behave. Jesus never turned aside from challenging evil, embodied evil or impersonal evil. He never walked away from it, and he never indulged it. Secondly, every pleasure that presents itself to the senses, if it be not purely for the honor and glory of God, must be renounced and completely rejected. I know of nothing that I do hour by hour throughout my life that I cannot dedicate to the honor and glory of God. I don't know of anything that I would want to do that does not have that purpose. I am certain that you are the same. And this for the love of Jesus Christ, who in this life had no other pleasure, neither desired any than to do the will of his Father. The path of the imitation of Christ is the path of the Christian mystics. Jesus said, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, deny his lesser self, deny the carnal mind, and take up his cross daily. Take up your daily karma. Let not the sun go down. Let not your head come to rest on your pillow, that you have not dealt with the karma of the day that has descended, with violet flame, with service, with love, with every possible response." It is such a glorious feeling to conclude a day and know that by communion with another soul, you have been able to turn that soul around and direct her back to God. Taking up your cross daily means this, not only the cross of your karma, but your dharma, your duty to be who you really are on the path of personal Christhood in the footsteps of Jesus. St. Philip Neri wrote, "Nothing more glorious can befall a Christian than to suffer for Christ." We can all ask, how can suffering be glorious? Isn't this drive for suffering on the part of mystics masochistic? Aren't they inflicting upon themselves this pain because they're psychologically sick? Not when you understand that suffering for Christ means bearing your karma for him, so that he doesn't have to bear it for you. When you refuse to carry your karma and balance it, you are demanding that Jesus carry it for you. That's not very nice, is it? And then you have to go beyond merely bearing your karma to bear Christ's karma. How about saying to Jesus, let me bear your karma, Lord. What is Jesus' karma? It's the karma of the whole world that he carries. Isn't it about time he had some light bearers and Christed ones on the earth who would help him carry that world karma? You can do it. I want to tell you something. You need to watch your mind and heart and your desire body. Because sometimes we fool ourselves and we don't know what we're really doing. But sometimes at a certain level, we simply refuse to bear the responsibility for our karma. Look at all the lawsuits that are going on in the country today. People try to collect money from people because they fell down in their yard or some such thing. We never heard of such lawsuits 25 years ago. People are always wanting someone else to pick up the tab for their misfortunes because the law of karma is not taught in this nation. That's why the nations of the West have gone into socialism. Let the government pay the bill for everything that happens to be your karma. Well, you only postpone the day when you will have to deal with it. So if we refuse to bear responsibility for our words, our actions, our deeds, if we are not willing to suffer the consequences of our ungodly words and deeds, this then becomes the boulder of pride and rebellion against the laws of God that utterly prevents our soul's reunion with God. This concerns me because you can get into a national consciousness or a local consciousness where you do not see what befalls you or what you do as your personal responsibility. And we have to lock into that idea. The saints and adepts who willingly underwent what seemed to us extreme torments and self-imposed afflictions or severe illnesses were balancing their personal karma in order to achieve their soul's realignment with God. We have to make up our minds that on the path of the masters of the Far East, we are all walking a path of karma yoga. You may follow other yogas, but karma yoga is upon you. It's upon you because your master called you. Your Lord Jesus, your Lord Moriel has called you to this path because he loves you and knows that you have a particularly heavy burden of karma, that you need the violet flame, that you need the path and the teaching, and you need to live a life of service so that you can meet all the people to whom you owe a debt, where that debt must be paid back personally. Many debts can be paid back with a violet flame, but others simply cannot be paid without personal interaction. I have seen people come on this path and be here a year or 2 or 5 or 3 months and pass on. And I've seen them on the other side that for having invoked the violet flame and known the teaching and known their mighty I Am presence, they have escaped the astral plane. Where they would not have entered even the first level of the etheric octave, they made it because they were diligent students while they had the time and the opportunity. Sometimes through their intense physical suffering, the saints were balancing planetary karma as well. Today, there's not one of us that is not in the process of dealing with karma. Whether people are balancing or transmuting, personal karma is another question entirely. You need to know that and search your heart and soul and call to God on a daily basis. You need to really discover whether you are dodging your duty and your assignment in this life because you've got a comfortable pension or a comfortable job, but you're really not engaged in this purging process, in the process of being purged, illumined, and ultimately united with God. Coming to grips with our psychology, seeking resolution in our relationships with our inner child are all part of the process of our souls attaining union with God. So my answer to the question, how can suffering be glorious, is that balancing your karma, paying back your debts to God and to every part of life, that is God, one by one, is glorious. Because none of us are truly happy deep down inside, and our souls can never be, until we have undone the wrongs we have done to any part of life who is God, all the way back to the beginning of time and our first incarnation. These are some of the things that burden and depress us. These are the causes for psychological problems. We must balance our debts, and what is so glorious in this age of mysticism, in the Aquarian age, is that we have the violet flame, and the violet flame given by us with full intensity and fervor and ardor on behalf of the entire planet is such a way of balancing so much karma through service to life. You know, each time you make things right with someone who has suffered needlessly because of your senseless doings, you achieve something, and that something is union. It is a union, great or small, with the God in that person. As long as we are enmeshed in a spiral of negative karma with the outer self, our outer self and someone else's outer self, we cannot know true oneness with the inner self of them or us. So each time you pay a price for this or that, you have eliminated the substance that is between you and someone else, and you have united with the God in them and open a channel whereby they can unite with the God in you. That's what balancing karma means. If you think you are on a treadmill, working 2 jobs to pay your debt, not seeing the end from the beginning, just remember, you've got a taskmaster in El Moria who loves you. And El Moria wants to see you get through it and not take it so slowly that you finally slow down to a stop. When the masters get you on the track of balancing karma, they want you to go for it. So don't ever think that just because you're in some part of drudgery in paying debts to life that, well, that isn't right because you should always be doing something great and creative and original and wonderful. There is drudgery in life. Yes, we create drudgery for ourselves with making karma. So we need to get down on our knees sometimes and scrub and scrub and scrub. For me, the alleviation of the suffering of one soul and many souls is my reason for being. It doesn't matter to me who has caused the suffering. I desire to relieve life of the burdens of unnecessary suffering. As you know, some suffering is necessitated by the law of karma. But where it is unnecessary, I want to be there to help someone be unburdened, to transmute pain through understanding and compassion, to lead someone out of the darkness of limited self-knowledge in the lesser self into the light of unlimited self-knowledge in the greater self. This, to me, is what makes life worth living. If I can't do this every day, I wonder why I'm walking the planet. If this brings me closer to God, and I balance personal and planetary karma in the process, well and good, but that's not what's important to me. For me, the joy of suffering is not a suffering at all. The joy is pure joy, and if there be pain, it is transmuted into the bliss of my union with God in every part of life. And the part of life that I love most being in union with is you. All of the wonderful chelas and keepers of the flame and souls who recognize the light and the path, who want to get somewhere beyond where you are in this moment. And I'm grateful that because of you, I have a reason for being, because I know that by the grace of God, I can take you there. I wrote down these thoughts as I was preparing this lecture because I asked someone about what they thought was the reason to bear suffering. And all they could say was, well, because you balance your karma and you attain union with God. And I said, is that all? What else happens? And I couldn't finally get someone to say that it's the very joy of bearing another person's burden, not for what it gets you, not because it gets you to union with God, you let God worry about that, but it's the very joy of the moment of experiencing that giving of the God flame, not because of some benefit you will receive. I think that I'm goal-oriented. Whatever it takes to achieve the goal, I can endure, I can suffer, because I see the end from the beginning. I used to have a sign that I wrote on my books in college, and it simply said, "This too shall pass." And I would visualize the day and date when I would be through. And I said, there's really no distance between where I am now and then. It will pass. And that little mantra eliminated time and space for me. And before I knew it, I graduated from college for what it was worth. I'm glad I graduated from El Moria's and Lanello's School of Hard Knocks, School of Purging, Illuminating, and Uniting with my heart. It was a school of the most profound love. Anyone who goes to the trouble of disciplining you and expending all the fire of his heart and being and soul to make you the person that he knows you are is a true friend and a real guru. You go after such ones because they're your real friends. Jesus said that he laid down his life for his sheep. He talked about the souls of the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The term sheep is the equivalent of soul. And I can tell you truly that when you are going to help people, you do lay down your life, your light, all that you are, your heart and your essence, because it takes that much love and that much proving to God that you really want to be the instrument for the saving of a single soul or many souls. I welcome you to the opportunity to save the souls on this planet who will never be touched or reached unless they are touched by you. Not so long ago, I had the opportunity to counsel some people, and I recognized that if I hadn't taken the time to counsel them, there would have been nowhere else that they could have gone to come to an understanding of who and what they were and what they had to do to get to be who they really are. And at the end of that day, which was a long and a hard day in itself, I actually wept for joy in the heart of Kuan Yin, because I realized that Kuan Yin herself is everywhere that we are and reaches out to people in the lowest octaves. And sometimes the only person that they will see is us as Kuan Yin. And I had such an appreciation of Kuan Yin's mercy as to how far she has traveled to bring our souls to this altar as just one of the great avatars of the ages. Her service is particularly touching, and the stories about her I've lectured on, they're on tapes, you might want to study them. But there is a great feeling of knowing that God has called you to that service, and that if you are listening and you are there and you are hearing, you just know in your heart that God is saying to you, if you don't speak to this person, no one else will. How will I contact them? How will I bring them home? They have nowhere else to go, no one to teach them. no one to save them. When you realize that this is what it means to give yourself to God, to know such tremendous joy of helping people and facilitating their entering the courts of heaven, I assure you, there is nothing in this world that you cannot easily give up in exchange for such immense gladness. It's only way I can describe it, immense gladness that you have really been useful to the universe. There is a path of a minimum of suffering. That path is the path of the seventh ray and of the violet flame. Instead of encountering all of the old situations and taking 1,000,000 years, that gift of Saint Germain has given to us this opportunity to accelerate. Sometimes the most suffering you have to bear is to just sit still in one place long enough to get the action of transmutation rolling at a peak alchemical pitch. It goes on at all levels, that is transmutation, when we invoke it. Not only does the violet flame expel toxins lodged in our physical organs, but it also transmutes the karmas and traumas of our present and past lives recorded in the 4 lower bodies. As you know, this is the etheric body, the mental body, the astral or desire, and the physical body. The lower figure in the chart of your divine self shows us that we can become the temple of God as we invoke the violet flame from our mighty I Am presence through our Holy Christ self. It is a profound teaching of Kabbalah that we must go through Tiferet to get to Keter. We must enter through the heart of Malchut, the mother, then through the Son, then to the Father. Saint Germain unveiled the violet flame to the world in 1929 through Guy and Edna Ballard of the I Am activity. It is the gift of his heart to all who would enter the golden age of Aquarius. Through the alchemy of the violet flame, which is the 7th ray aspect of the Holy Spirit, the unredeemed, unperfected soul can become a partaker of the divine nature here and now in this life. If it were not for Saint Germain with his twin flame and consort, the Lady Master Portia, our sponsors, who are the hierarchs of the Aquarian age, we would not be invoking the violet flame today for the transmutation of all sin, disease, and death. Saint Germain received the dispensation to give to the light bearers of the world this gift of the violet flame in the 20th century. And he got that dispensation only on the condition that he would pay the price if people misused it. Think of the sacrifice he made to make that commitment to the lords of karma. He would pay the price for our misuse of the violet flame. How do we misuse the violet flame? We call forth the violet flame and then we go out and we're not forgiving to our neighbor or loving. We abuse people or animals or the planet. All kinds of things that violate the 7th ray aspect of the Holy Spirit. Saint Germain knew that some would misuse the violet flame, yet he was willing to take that burden upon himself for the sake of those who would use it for the blessing of all mankind and for their personal victory in the light. Did you know that Jesus invoked the violet flame and that he taught his disciples how to invoke it too? The Akashic records reveal that Jesus used the violet flame in his healings and miracles, that he initiated his closest disciple, John the Beloved, in its use. John the Beloved saw the violet light, and he walked in the violet light. He knew the violet light to be the essence of the body and blood of Christ, and he knew the violet flame as the all-consuming fire that transmutes the cause and core of sin or karma. Maybe that's why he was the only disciple who ascended at the conclusion of that life. John the Beloved made his ascension. Jesus gave him that gift, and why did he give it? Because of all the disciples, he loved the most. John had the greatest love in his heart, the greatest development of the heart chakra. As you know, the violet flame is the seventh ray aspect of the Holy Spirit. Jesus said in a dictation through Mark Prophet that at the age of 17, he had a mystical experience in which he was contacted by Holy Amethyst, the archee of the seventh ray. She is the divine complement of Archangel Zadkiel. Jesus said, "I was alone with God." Just stop there. Can anything truly mystical happen to you if you don't have the courage to be alone with God? If all your days are filled with people and appointments or recreation or this or that, when you're always with someone and you don't even have a moment to listen to your own thoughts? I was alone with God. When was the last time you were alone with God? Uninterrupted, phone off the hook, TV set off, dog out, cat out. When was the last time you really set up the circumstance where you absolutely could not be disturbed and you could be free to go up the step and the next step and the next step? I was alone with God, and around me the grass commingled with myriad daisy-like flowers whose upturned faces seemed to take hope from my gaze. I communed with God and sent my love to the flowers below my feet. Suddenly they were transformed, and I saw them no more as flowers, but as the faces of men. I mused and meditated upon them, and I spake unto my Father, unto my God, and unto your God. And I said, "Can I raise them up?" The Son of God, who has come on his mission, in all humility asks the question, can I really do it? Think of this tender moment. Can I raise them up? And the Father spake unto me and said, "Come see ye." And suddenly I was transported beyond that field, and the cosmos was before me, and my feet were placed as upon a rock in outer space, and all around me I saw the stars that they did shine, worlds of hope and worlds without hope. And I felt as though I were a shepherd of planetary significance, and as though each face of the flowers that had been below me in the field were indeed now a planet teeming with multitudes of people and requiring the hope and the release of God's energy that came through me then in that experience. I was transformed. I was electrified. My soul did rejoice, and as David of old I sang an hymn unto God. I found myself after this experience wandering in the pasture and upon the meadow there. And for a moment I was dazed at the experience. I reeled as one drunken. And then, out of the soft folds of the night, stepped beloved Holy Amethyst, and she enfolded me in the love of Lord Zadkiel and her own. In this dictation, Jesus also spoke about the violet flame. He said, "Although circumstances come to thee with crushing effect, your mighty I am presence and the violet transmuting flame of Saint Germain will stand by you through thick and thin, as you would say it. Through the violet transmuting flame, how much of the human karma is consumed and lifted, mankind cannot imagine."